The only conclusion that a serious, unbiased researcher can draw is that, in a way, we do not understand significant aspects of human personality survive the death of the physical body. And now, life is different after that.
So, Piero, thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Parisetti, it's very much an honor for us to have you here. It's great. I'm so happy to have you. I'm also excited, we have both been at an European IONS conference before, and it has always been really exciting as scientists to look at this very exciting topic of what happens after death and what can we learn from it and how can we work with it. And so for today's interview, I'll be so excited to talk about consciousness with you, about grief, about exceptional experiences, and also a bit about the question, of course, what you think happens after death. And before we go into all of those interesting questions, I'd like to ask you, could you maybe tell us a bit about who you are, what your professional background is, and how you came to work on questions of consciousness, exceptional experiences, and grief?
Thank you very much, Vera. It's a great pleasure for me too. But please, let's leave honor aside. I'm not an honorable person. I'm actually a very lucky person who managed to pursue, great interests in his life with a modicum of success. So I'm just lucky. I'm not important or worthy of honor. Yes, I'm Italian born, but I've not lived in Italy in so many years, 35 years now. I originally graduated as a medical doctor, and I specialized in public health because I wanted to work for the International Red Cross. I wanted to work in humanitarian operations, which I did very happily for a number of years at the beginning of my career. And then after an unhappy stint at the United Nations in New York, I moved from operations to the classroom because I started the first academic career as a lecturer in public health and emergency management, which I did up until 2017. Meanwhile, a Western educated medical doctor, so I was born and bred in an intellectual environment steeped in materialism and physicalism. And I never had any reason to put that into question. And one day, so many times I've told this story because it's exactly what happened. It happened that we were living in Geneva in Switzerland at the time. And my lovely wife, Angela, one day, 2004, imagine, so a few years ago, over tea in our kitchen, she tells me about a little spooky story, a little adventure that happened to her when she was a late adolescent in Glasgow. She's Scottish. One of those stories, Vera, I'll tell you very frankly. If anybody told me at the time, I would have smiled politely and moved on. See what is this nonsense? Well, but I could tell that after all these years, she was still slightly perturbed by this experience, and she's the person I know best and I trust most. And so, with the stiff upper lip I had back then, I told myself, let me see if anything serious has been written on this, nonsense. And soon as I started looking, I stumbled upon the 575 pages written by David Fontana, who unfortunately died about 10 years ago, a revered professor of transpersonal psychology in the UK, and the founder of the transpersonal section of the British Psychological Society. So literally an academic with ironclad qualifications and repute. And that made me overcome my boggle threshold in a way. And the title of the book is there an afterlife? ? a comprehensive review of the evidence. Well. To this day, those nearly 600 pages were followed by about another 30,000. And I'm talking about, anecdotal literature, but a lot of investigations and proper scientific literature. I became member of several professional scientific organizations like IANS, we've just spoken about, International Association for Near-Death Studies, the Society for Psychical Research, the Parapsychological Association, which is the academic body that gathers a few hundred academic parapsychologists in the world. I went to conferences, I went to study days. I even dragged myself to rural Alabama to train personally with Raymond Moody.
Oh, fantastic. How exciting.
On his psychomantium technique. And the thing that I so much fell into the rabbit hole, as one would say, that at some stage I even actually changed my academic career. I switched. I've done a doctorate at the University of Northampton with a thesis in clinical parapsychology, exactly. And we will talk about perhaps clinical parapsychology. No, let's say this now. So today, I fancy myself a clinical parapsychologist. What the heck? What is a clinical parapsychologist? Somebody who studies the relationship between exceptional experiences and health. Mm-hmm. This relationship is bidirectional because we know that these exceptional experiences, which we'll define in a second, if I may, they often have an impact generally on psychological health, quite significant, mostly benign, mostly adaptive and positive. But we also know that a number of conditions and situations of health concern have an impact on exceptional experiences, for instance, near-death experiences, but not on. So today I am in the company of all my fellow academic parapsychologists in a struggle for funding for research. So I hope that a couple of project proposals I put in recently will be approved, so I will be able to remain as a research fellow at the University of Northampton. But that is my life today. And so you understand that having been able to pursue such scholarly intellectual interests to this level, because that's what I do today, is a great luck.
I have a lot of structured question in a very structured way, but I have to ask one question in between, just following up on something that you said. You said that you find that there is a relationship between health and exceptional experiences. Can you talk a bit about what is the relationship and why you think that relationship is there?
Oh, it's not that I think. It's an empirical finding. It's a fact that you look at the data and that's it.
So tell me a bit about it. What is it and how would you interpret it?
Okay, let's begin with giving a definition of exceptional experience, right? Because that's very important. Parapsychology studies human experiences that seem to defy the way we expect the world to work. Okay. And this is a general, very understandable definition. If we want to get a little more technical, we refer to the basic limiting principles formulated by a philosopher brought in the UK, I think already in the early 60s or thereabouts. And these principles essentially is a epistemological principles. They should guide the way we discover and learn about the world. And for instance, the principle says that an effect can never precede a cause. Mm-hmm. A sacrosanct principle of causality. Normally, you have a cause which is followed by the effect. That is how we expect the world to work. Well, we have tons of empirical evidence, both in a naturalistic environment and in strictly controlled laboratory conditions, that tells us that humans can consciously and or unconsciously be aware of events that have not happened yet. That's an abrupt, open violation of the principle of causality, and we have plenty of evidence for that. Therefore, that's one area, for instance, the study of precognition and presentiment is one of the exceptional experiences studied by parapsychology. The last of the limiting principles is that, and this is crucial to what I understand our discussion to be today, Freud says that it is self-evident in a way. It's a given that what we call mind is nothing but the electrochemical activity of the brain.
Or if I may rephrase it, the brain makes the mind, right?
Right. So the exchange of chemical mediators, neurotransmitters, equals the sensation of tasting chocolate. Right, which philosophically I find is phenomenal stupid, and there's the corollary to that principle. If mind is produced by the brain, if mind is nothing but the brain, it follows that when brain stops functioning, mind goes, mind ceases to exist. Well, we have an ocean of evidence studied by parapsychology that tells us otherwise. The only conclusion that I believe a serious, unbiased researcher who has really engaged with the evidence can draw is that, in a way, we do not understand significant aspects of human personality survive the death of the physical body. I am absolutely not one to get into attempted explanations. I always make the proviso, in a way we do not understand. I am an empiricist, I'm an experimentalist, and a clinician. I'm not in the business of making theories. So what I can say to the best of my intellectual honesty is that I am convinced, I am rationally convinced on the basis of evidence that mind survives physical death.
If I quickly may jump in, and I hope you will remember what you were about to say, but what are the most significant arguments, or you would maybe even, or I would even want to say proofs or strongest arguments for you to argue for the survival of the mind?
All right. So this takes us in quite a big detour. So we will remember that with this defined exceptional experiences, and we will come back to the relationship between those experiences and health.
Yes.
Okay? That's where we start.
Yes.
Now, if you ask me a very brief, succinct, very concentrated review of the evidence for survival, I'm glad to say we will be here for the next week talking 24 hours a day for a week, right? Yeah. Because it truly is an ocean of evidence. An ocean of evidence, and my way, which is personal, other people may slice the cake in different ways, but I have identified about 12 areas of evidence which are diverse, they're independent from each other, and they're very unlike, they're very diverse, and that's in itself is a strength for the argument. And within those areas, and really we don't want to get into the now a list and everything, but I think that the three pillars, the foundations, all the areas are important, but the what I consider to be the three foundations are near-death experiences, mediumship, that is what we technically call anomalous information reception, and reincarnation studies. And you understand, I only mentioned three, and you already understood that these three are completely different and independent. They come from areas of investigation, of inquiry, that have nothing to do with each other. Near-death experiences we know, and what I always stress, always want to stress and put forward is that before being strongly suggestive of survival of personality of bodily death, the evidence from near-death experiences is utterly incompatible with the paradigm mind equals brain.
Mm-hmm.
The experience as it is told to us by the experiencers is true, then forcibly mind is more than brain. That's right. So, and that is fundamental philosophically. That is an exceptional and important conclusion. Then also it is very strong. I mean, it's easy. It's easy to draw a conclusion when you look at the persons, the scientists who have dedicated their lives to the study of the phenomenon. You will agree with me that they all, without exception, are convinced and are very vocal about the fact that near-death experiences are, quote unquote, strongly suggestive of life after life. Even our friend Sam Parnia, who had been, I wouldn't say on the fence, but has been a little more reserved than others. In his latest book, he goes, wow, full thing. Yes, survive. Right. So, and this is one thing. Mediumship, we call it in technical terms, anomalous information reception. And with that, we refer to the capacity, the alleged capacity by research mediums, and I will say something briefly about that, to provide accurate and specific information. And these are two different things about this kind of personality they could know nothing about, and in the absence of any contact with what we call the sitter, that is the person who's requesting the information. Okay. So now a very, very brief word about mediums. And it is my sad conclusion, after having been in this game now for nearly a quarter of a century, that the vast majority of the people calling themselves mediums have in reality no gift. I'm not talking about charlatans or people who are profiteers, no. I'm just talking about people who, mostly out of good intentions, they delude themselves and they delude the people who go see them. In reality, they have no gift. And there's a small minority of persons who do have a gift. And then there's a tiny minority, maybe less than 24 people around the world, who have such a spectacular gift. And we don't yet begin to understand why this gift is so unevenly distributed in the population. But that's a fact, right? So these last two categories, so the good mediums and the exceptional mediums, are research mediums, because many of them were kind enough to subject themselves to laboratory experiments. And we have today, there are 14 replications, independent replications by different laboratories and different researchers of a multiple blind protocol. The maximum blinding is 5 levels. Quintuple blind protocol, that is, there's 5 levels of separation between the sitter who wants to hear information and the medium who provides it, right?
Wow.
I tell you, there's been a meta-analysis on these 14 studies a couple of years ago, and the results are unequivocal. The effect size is small to medium, but the p-value is astronomical. The likelihood that these collective results were produced by chance is vanishingly small.
if somebody is listening, like I used to be, like you seem to have used to be, and very scientific. I used to be a strict materialist as well. So I think listening to something like this can be very surprising or moving, or it can even make you feel like you want to object very strongly because it's so removed from strict materialism. But that said, you're talking about actual studies that were done. They are there. So I think anybody with an open mind, as you said earlier, who really wants to go into the subject and really research and go beyond bias, they will have to look at those studies and your links.
I open yet another little bubble, then we come back.
Yes.
So I happen, aside from my scientific role as a researcher, I happen to be a public figure, particularly in my native Italy, a place where I've not been living for 35 years now. I'm a very, very, very small celebrity because of the things I have to say, etc. And therefore, I felt compelled by my intellectual honesty to provide credibility, to back up when I say my claims, I never present, as I said, my theories. I'm just, as a university lecturer, as you know all too well, we present evidence produced by others, and we systematize and present. So, backing up my discourse about psychic powers and survival, I published last year a book which I think is rather unique because it is a systematic review of 50 peer-reviewed articles concerning mediumship, both the description of the quintuple blind protocol and the meta-analysis. But those 50 articles, I think, are really, again, we're talking about Nature, we're talking of Physics Review B, the IEEE proceedings, so top journals who have published peer-reviewed articles about parapsychology research. So a scientifically minded person who understands the basics of statistics and the thesis of the book, that what really I want to show with the book is that the methods commonly employed by natural and social sciences have been used for 150 years to study exceptional experiences and the survival of personality.
Piero, super good. And we'll put the links underneath the video so that everybody who is scientifically minded and interested and who wants to, falsify, verify, they're so invited to do that. So join the discussion.
I would say study and then make up your mind.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yes.
We're discussing, I will interrogate you slightly. I will ask you a few undergraduate level questions. If you're able to answer those questions, then I'm happy to discuss. Often we are faced with critics and people who want to debate who do not know the basics. They don't know the evidence. They don't know the methods we day in and day out use.
And then it moves into a more kind of religious or opinionated discussion, which nobody really wants because they are not getting us anywhere, right? The scientific method is applied here. So that's where you want to go. So, you were talking about the major 3 pillars on which you would base your, I would say, your strong conviction that the mind goes on. And you mentioned near-death experiences. We were just talking about mediumship. And the third one?
The third one is reincarnation studies.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Reincarnation refers to courts, as Professor Stevenson called them, cases of the reincarnation type. And we now have the Division of Perceptual Studies of the University of Virginia. We have a database, an archive, actually a physical archive with plenty of documents about 2,500 cases gathered mostly by them, but also by other academics around the world. For instance, the famous Erlendur Haraldsson of the University of Iceland and others. And these cases refer to the phenomenon where a child, when he or she begins talking around, 2.5 years of age, they start talking about another life. I had, there's a case here, and there's been a famous case in Scotland, because they say all these things have only happened in India. Not at all. They've been reported and recorded in all continents of the world. So they don't. And the case of little Callum is telling, because Callum born to a single mother in a really rough area of Glasgow, tough going, and bringing up a child as a single mother in this area of Glasgow. Poor woman. Not only that, but when Callum starts talking, to the total astonishment and distress of her mother, he says, "But you're not my mom. I have a Bara mom. I have a Bara dad. Bara is a tiny island in the in the Western Hebrides, which I visited with my wife years ago. And I can relate, because Callum says, and we lived in a white house by the beach. And from my window, I could see the plane taking off and landing on the beach. And that's exactly the plane my wife and I took coming back from the Isle of Bar. It's absolutely extraordinary. And how could little Callum grew up in Possil, Glasgow, probably never left his area of town, at age 2, dream up the White House by the beach where he could see the plane.
Especially the airplane is a bizarre fact, right? And if people are more interested also in other cases, there are many now online on YouTube. Some are so significant and have these specific details that can also be researched and have been proven to be correct.
The idea of made-up memories is really difficult to entertain. I'm no specialist in reincarnation, but I've just read, like anybody who has an interest in these things. Why? Because, again, exceptional experiences and health. Here, really, this gives us a very good entry into going back to our original thing. So these memories are obviously an exceptional experience. They have health consequences, because the children are highly distressed by these memories. They feel that they do not belong to the reality they find themselves in. The families are double distressed, because they don't know what to do with this situation. It's a hyper tense and stressful situation, and God forbid that, unfortunately, in many cases, families try to repress these memories on the part of the child, creating additional trauma. It really is a pickle, as we say in the UK. It's a mess, one would say, a sorry mess. Conversely, when the family gives in to the insistent requests by the child to go visit the purported family before, which often is at very distance, in different conditions, different social classes, different occupations, different everything, then the child calms down, sort of, manages somehow to negotiate this double belonging, this double allegiance, and then in any case, whether the memories are they're trying to suppress them or they're somehow allowed to be, in the majority of cases, around age 7 to 9, the memories fade away.
Why is that, by the way? Why do you think that is? We don't know, right? And you said earlier that you are a scientist who is focused on the research facts, not so much on interpretation. But if I were to press a bit harder and say, what do you think why that is?
Honestly, to tell you the truth, I really have no explanation.
Yeah.
Just to be precise, not in all cases.
Yeah.
We have quite a number of grown-up adults for whom the memories are as vivid and as alive as they were when they were small.
When one goes a bit into this direction and listens to people who study this area, many of them are very critical about trying to find out what your previous life was through hypnosis, for example.
Yeah. I am as critical of myself.
And many people say that it's very hard to distinguish between true memories and false memories, because as we also know from criminal cases or research done when people are interrogated on something that happened in the past, memories can change, they can blur, they can be combined with something you read or heard. You can believe it's your memory, but maybe it's not. So can you tell us a bit about grown-up reincarnation?
So I completely agree, but I also agree on the back of the skepticism of Professor Ian Stevenson himself, who's the one who's pioneered the research in children, right? We have no mechanisms and no motivation for these memories to be implanted in children. They're maladaptive. They make the child feel bad. They make the family be stressed. There's no advantage whatsoever.
Yeah.
In the case of, and that's the other often, as you say, often cited area of evidence in support of reincarnation is regression hypnosis. But already at the time of Stevenson, the researchers of reincarnation say, hold on a sec, not really, because we know of a number of mechanisms that may create memories which are perceived and lived as real memories, but they're actually not. And even these imagined events can trigger post-traumatic stress syndrome. They are so powerful and perceived to be so real that they can produce PTSD. So when I talk about adults who retain the childhood memories, I'm not talking about adults who have been allegedly regressed and remember things, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about children who remember details about a previous life, and they keep them. Instead of the memories waning and fading away aged 7 to 9, they stay and they keep going into adult life, which is really, really bizarre. One of these cases was a janitor in Britain, in England, who kept remembered a previous life in Petra in Jordan, the ruins and, maybe 3,000 years ago, and remembered details which were examined by professional archaeologists. And I remember a quote from the archaeologist saying, there is no way in the world that this person of dim intelligence, no culture, never traveled, could have acquired these obscure details about the life in Petra and what was going on in Petra at the time and everything. So that is also interesting. But again, do not confuse all that with the forensic level investigation that the researchers do on the cases of reincarnation type with children. If you take 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, the first scholarly book by Ian Stevenson, 1974, it's a very thick book, and it is a complete bore. It's page after page after page of tables in which details refer to the child, sources of corroboration, and this and that with the names and the signatures, but literally like forensic science to ensure that these memories actually have a foundation and that the child could not have acquired them through any other means. So very, very interesting.
I would love to dig in deeper into this direction, but let us come back once more to where we started, and then we'll move on to other questions as well. Namely, you said this relationship between health and exceptional experiences. Did we cover everything you wanted to add to that? Then please go on once more. And the next step that we'll take is a bit into the views of Kastrup and Faggin, because I'd like to listen a bit about what you think about their approaches and thoughts.
Absolutely. So let's stay for a moment with exceptional experiences and health, which really is my area of specialty. And let's start with I wouldn't say simpler, but let's say start with one causation arrow. So certain health conditions that are associated with exceptional experiences. We've spoken about near-death experience, right? A condition in which there's not always, but very often, there is a severe deterioration of the health conditions, and in many cases, a cessation of the electrochemical activity of the brain. And I stress that a cessation because, 20 seconds into cardiac arrest, there is no brain. End of story. And those who say, oh, but there are a few neurons still firing, please do study the physiopathology of cardiac arrest and look at the sequence of events. I always say when the gagging reflex and the corneal reflex, which are arc reflexes, they originate, if you can see on the camera, at this level on the brainstem. When they are out, it means that anything above this level is offline. There is no brain activity, and yet people report experiences, right? That in itself, not only the nature of the experience is exceptional, but the very fact that they have and build memories about an experience is in itself extraordinary. Okay. Another example of relationship between a health condition and an exceptional experience is, I don't know if you probably yourself, since you're very much aware of the field, but if any of our listeners would have heard about the very well produced series of there's a podcast called the Telepathy tapes.
Yeah.
This is what I would call a naturalistic setting investigation, because it's not in laboratory conditions. But from what I could see, because there's the podcast and there are also videos accompanying the podcast, is that very well controlled conditions, not 100%, not watertight, but everything, to my sense as a researcher, everything points to a genuine phenomenon whereby autistic, non-communicating children seem to have an astonishing telepathic link with their mother. Okay. These are children or young adults who do not verbalize, they're not verbal. When they communicate, they only communicate through a tablet where they can point to letters and form with even very, very complex sequences, very complex communication. And your typical experimental setup is that you have the mother in one room, and the mother is looking at the picture, and the child in another room, separate, non-communicating, is asked to describe the picture, and the results are simply stunning. So, okay, you have a health condition, which is non-communicating autism, and an exceptional experience.
So if I were to generalize a bit from the aspects that you already named, near-death experiences and autism, is there a relationship between the less the brain works, the stronger the mind comes through?
This is a very strong suggestion, not a conclusion, but something that many of us like to think. We see, and I'll give you another example of an area of evidence that seem to support the filter theory of. So the brain would actually be, number one, a transducer,
a receiver.
Transducer, because it does not only receive from quote unquote the outside, it also transmits.
Okay.
Because some information from the so-called material world is conveyed over there, wherever that is. So my brain as a transducer.
Okay, super.
Normally functioning brain, a very highly filtered transducer that only lets through a small part of what would be available. Okay, I'm talking in really generalities here because it's just an idea. It's not a proper theory, but I quite like the idea. Now, listen to this. At the PA conference in Freiburg, PA Parapsychological Association, in summer last year, Maurice Friedman shows up. And Maurice Friedman is your run-of-the-mill academic neurologist. In the course of his work, he learns that people with lesions in a certain part of the prefrontal cortex here on the left seem to report more frequently exceptional experiences. And Maurice is intellectually curious enough to ask the question, oh la la, but we do have a well-known and very effective method to temporarily and reversibly inhibit the activity of that particular area of the brain.
Through magnetic fields, right?
Magnetic stimulation, etc. So he devised a very good protocol, and his participants, when that area was inhibited through transcranial magnetic stimulation or rather inhibition, performed better at a precognitive Ganzfeld experiment. So, bang, you induce a temporary so-called brain lesion, and people perform better at exceptional experiences.
Can you give an example as to which type of exceptional experience was easier for them to have?
You only tested precog Ganzfeld.
Can you talk a bit about like how that manifested? What did people see in the laboratory? What happened concretely?
Ganzfeld experiments are the most replicated, I would say, in the history of parapsychology because it's a very good protocol known to produce consistent results. Okay. So a normal Ganzfeld tests telepathy. It means that you have in one room or a section of the laboratory, very separated and very isolated, you have a research assistant looking at a video randomly selected by a computer amongst a big range of possibilities. In another room of the laboratory, you have your study participants. Ganzfeld, from German means whole field. And whole field referred to the fact that the person has ping pong balls on their eyes, which makes a kind of a very uniform field with a red light, and that uniform field that takes on a reddish ochre tinge. I've done it myself and performed well, by the way.
Good for you, or maybe not.
And they have headphones with white noise. And so Ganzfeld is putting the person in a state of relaxation, which was thought in the 70s to be very conducive to high performance, right? And it actually turned out to be. So during the maybe 20 or 30 minutes, when the person relaxes in the chair with this whole field, the person is asked to describe their meditation, to talk about what comes to their mind, just in a verbal manner, and all that is recorded. At the end of the session, the person is shown 4 videos, and they're asked to choose which one they thought the research assistant was looking at.
Mm-hmm.
What would chance predict, Vera?
1/4.
25%, isn't it? Because that's a chance alone was responsible for the choice of the participants. The hit rate would be 25%.
Yeah.
We have hundreds of thousands of individual trials, maybe not hundreds, tens of thousands of individual trials in literature, and all the meta-analysis consistently show a hit rate of 33%.
Uh-huh.
If you put together the number of trials and the effect size you end up with a p-value which is the size of the visible universe.
Oh, wow.
So basically the result with the inhibition of the frontal cortex was then that this percentage rate would even go up once people had part of their brain inhibited.
Not only because what I described here is normal Ganzfeld. A twist which has become very popular recently in the procedure is precognitive Ganzfeld. So the target video is chosen at random by the computer after the experiment is finished, right? So at the moment when the participant describes what he or she is seeing or what's coming, etc., the video has not even been chosen by the computer, let alone watched by the research assistant.
How about when the participant chooses 1 out of 4? Is that still also before the actual video is chosen?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
And that is because it's very easy to understand the fact that choosing 1, 4, or etc. That's very, and this is done regularly. But then there's a lot of depth and nuance when you look at the mentation, because when you look at the qualitative data, then independent judges look at what the participant said and match it to one of the 4 target videos. And there too, you have exactly the same process. We have now Caroline Watts, the former chair of the Kustler Parapsychology unit in Edinburgh, which is essentially the parapsychology department where most of the big hitters of the world today. My own head of department, Chris Rowe, studied there. So Caroline is a goddess. And she presented recently at Porto 6 weeks ago 2 replications of a precognitive Ganzfeld study run according to the open science protocol. And those 2 replications, in the opinion of many observers, are the best ever run methodologically, the best run experiments in the whole history of parapsychology. And the excellence in methodology puts to shame the vast majority of experiments in any other scientific discipline. So really.
Super. That is so exciting, Piero. And I'd like to invite everybody, to go to these studies, read them, and form your opinion based on them.
Certain exceptional experiences have consequences on health, okay?
Yes.
And these consequences are often adaptive and positive. So now research tells us that there's a variable percentage between 40 and 80% of people who have lost a loved one have what we call sensory experiences of the deceased. They have a spontaneous experience of reunion with the deceased. If they are accepted for what they appear to be, they have a major impact on the grief recovery process. All the research tells us that they are strongly, strongly adaptive. If they are refuted on religious grounds, because, my religious says that this is the devil talking to me, or if they are pathologized, no, don't think about that because means that you're going cuckoo, they are maladaptive and they're stressing and they actually impede the grief recovery process. That's essentially a number of these experiences, like we were talking about near-death experiences. NDEs show a consistent pattern of very beneficial psychological and behavioral changes. It's like they all went through a form and they come out psychologically shaped the same way.
Yeah.
And changes they impact really significantly psychological health, but only if they are integrated, only if they are accepted, only if they are accommodated within a worldview. And so as clinicians, we have to create culture around this phenomenon. phenomena, explain what they are, so that those who have these experiences can more easily accept them, because when they do accept them, and often it takes a few years, then the changes appear and their quality of life and psychological health explodes.
We will actually come back to the question of grief and how to cope with grief in a moment still, because I know this is your central topic and it interests me a lot. When you were just talking, I had a thought, because at the last IONS conference in Chicago in 2025, Bruce Grayson actually gave a very interesting overview of a study that he did, which exactly goes in your direction. Namely, he looked at long-term influences of near-death experiences on people's lives. And what is so fascinating for me as a physicist is that these are in no way comparable to dream effects, to effects that hallucinations have, that drug experiences, that DMT experiences have. And as you said, it's like a shape that everybody comes out of, meaning that no matter what your culture, your age, your religion, when you've had a near-death experience, the way that you come out, coming from this study and from many books and interviews that you can see with people, but also from this study, is very much the same. You are changed in an ethical way. You want to be more conscious, more careful with other people, more considering. It never comes out a way that you had a near-death experience and you suddenly understand that you want to make more money or similar, or you want to do something with your life, travel the world or so. It's not something, but what is consistent is a change in your ethical, moral system, and that's coherent and always in the same way. People also lose their fear of death, they have the feeling that everything is very much connected, and then that there is a purpose to this life. So even people who have committed suicide and were saved from this don't normally have suicidal thoughts still, because they have the feeling that it makes sense to be here and that it's not at them to choose the moment to go. So that's a very consistent pattern. And I personally find that super interesting and very relevant, because it shows yet again that this is very different from the other brain-related phenomena that we experience as humans.
And these all at once, which you very correctly you have pointed out, have health consequences, because they turn into clinical indicators of better psychological health. Okay? Psychometrically assessed, people are better after this experience. So, exceptional experience and health. Let's talk consciousness for a moment.
Yeah, I have. Let us just take a quick look into the future together. So I'd like to talk about Kastrup and Faggin, because I know that you have thought a lot about them as well, and I think people will want to hear a bit about it. We don't have to dive extremely deeply, which we could and which would be fantastic, but I just want to talk a bit about it. And then at the end, I'd like to yet once more turn back to grief therapy, so that we'll end with somewhat existential questions, but also questions about grief coping. But let's first go into Kastrup and Faggin. Like, how would you very briefly summarize what they have said? Not entirely, I don't want you to summarize their work, not that, but what has been relevant to you and how you position yourself towards what they've said.
Totally. I'm a little puzzled by you putting Bernardo and Federico in the same sort of sentence, but
why not? Why not? Let's try it.
We'll come to that in a second, but I have to make, because this is I'm happy to come out in a way and disclose this to maybe a wider public who's not necessarily interested in that. But I am living a very particular moment in my life, because for about 2 decades, I've been a devotee of the philosophical spiritual tradition called known as Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual tradition of the late Vedic period of India, right? And that is an absolute idealist monism.
Okay.
Ultimate nature of reality is one monism, and that reality is consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. Brahman only exists all the rest is an illusion. And Brahman is being, consciousness, bliss. So a radical, austere, absolute idealism monism, which actually then resurfaces with the Neoplatonics about 500 BC in Greece, in Europe. And then you find dotted all around the Middle Ages with a few mystics and philosophers. It then resurfaces very strongly with a number of idealist philosophers, a la Bernardo Kastrup today. Why did I say I'm very excited? Because after 20 years of studying and reflecting and meditating on this concept, a couple of months ago, I got it. And this was a moment unfortunately, this incarnation of mine is not for experiencing. I don't think I will have a transformative experience like Federico or Koch but I had a moment of deep intellectual realization where all these concepts came together and they became truth. And now, life is different after that. Is extraordinary. Anyhow, Bernardo formulates exactly the same concepts about the mental nature of reality with the language of modern philosophy. And I find this really useful and refreshing, because if you look at Vedanta, in fact, Vedanta is philosophy. There's the bhakti, the devotional aspects of that spiritual is almost secondary. The importance is the knowledge. The important is the concept, the idea that consciousness only exists, right? Which is essentially what Bernardo says. And what Bernardo managed brilliantly to solve is the decombination process. So essentially, if everything is consciousness, why am I not aware of what's going on in your mind, Vera, at the moment? Well, parapsychology says that I can dimly be aware of certain things, but if everything is consciousness, we should be fully aware of the phenomenal content that's present in each other's mind. And we know that is not the case. And so Bernardo refers to a phenomenon we know that happens in the dissociative personality disorder, whereby within one person, separate personalities emerge called alters. So in two words, Bernardo's idea is that we all belong to mind at large, this universe of consciousness, but we are somehow separated by this dissociation boundary. And therefore, we're not aware. We're still mind. We're still made of mind, like everything else, like the world and everything. But we live in a little bit of a bubble. And what we see, he has this beautiful metaphor, the world we see across the dissociation boundary are the thoughts of God impinging on that boundary, which is, it's a metaphor and it's not meant to explain anything. So, as a Vedantin, I adore Kastrup. I kind of cooperate. I find myself relatively often with Federico in public settings in Italy, and I heard his theory put forward many times. And since I do not possess the tools to evaluate the technical part, the Dariano paper, the paper is written with Dariano, and for me, that's hieroglyphics. I cannot even read the mathematical formalism. So that's let alone engage with the ideas. They're so much beyond my intellectual technical ability to understand that I cannot say anything. The way the theory is presented in Federico's public discourse does not add anything to my own understanding.
And just for people who are listening, I won't be able to now, without preparation at least, very briefly summarize to the core what Federico Faggin is saying, but you can find many videos on YouTube. And that said, I can actually say a few things just so that everybody knows what we're talking about. So Faggin is using quantum field theory and quantum mechanics, famous theories from physics, to try to build a bridge into the world of the mind. And so very briefly, giving you an example of how he does that, in quantum mechanics, you have certain moments where everything is unclear, and out of this very real but undefined state of being, through measurement can come a very clear and concise decision. So from something that seems like freedom of choice comes something very specific. That said, even though I'm using words like freedom, choice, undefined, etc., we have to be very careful in reality not to map these one-to-one to the words that we use in everyday life. So when I say there is a freedom of choice, we as human beings have the feeling that we are free to act, but that kind of freedom is a different kind of freedom. So that said, sometimes Federico Faggin maps these all too quickly. He says because there are structures in quantum mechanics that sound and feel very much like when we talk about the mind, he quickly identifies similar structures and ideas from quantum mechanics with things from the mind, So here we would have to dig a lot deeper, whether we find this justified or not. I sometimes find it too fast, and I understand what you say, that you say it's not so easy to follow what he says, because of course quantum mechanics and quantum field theory is very hard. I just wanted to quickly make that bracket, open it and close it for people who are listening and want to know what we're talking about.
I'm just back from a conference at the University of York. I came back last night, where he should have been, but unfortunately there was a health problem with his wife, that lovely Elvia, so he could only be there in via Zoom. And he repeated again. I mean, the quantum fields are conscious. They want to know themselves, and the collapse of the wave function, so the movement from potentiality to actuality, is an expression of free will. The electron appears as a particle because the electron field expresses its free will through that, which is indeed, conceptually a fascinating thing. But the only thing that really resonates with me is the very broad assumption that consciousness is fundamental. That consciousness becomes before matter. Actually, for me, matter personally. And here, I don't speak as a scientist. I speak about a devotee and an amateur philosopher. Matter doesn't even exist. But never mind. That's my position.
In criminal profiling, sometimes an investigation can not produce facts, but they can produce leads. And I think that sometimes at the border of our scientific knowledge, it's fair enough to think about, okay, so what do we see with the mind? What are the phenomena that we see, and where in other sciences do we see something similar, and can we not match it? I think that's fair enough. It's very creative. Maybe it's even correct, but it's not possible at this stage to know and to, conduct any kind of experiment, as far as I'm aware of, to decide whether this analogy that he has found is based on anything real, if you will, or if it's just a very fascinating analogy. Yeah.
And I know that the time is running out, but I'm sure you are aware of Donald Hoffman.
Absolutely. And I just quickly want to say, everybody, listen to Donald Hoffman as well. He has very fascinating ideas as well. I'm personally quite critical of some of these approaches because, and I just want to say one phrase, very relevant from NDE reportings, is that they all feel, I think it's like 20 or 25% of them or 30% who meet this light made of love that interacts with them, which is very interesting that worldwide, through all cultures and ages, they meet this light of love. Yeah. that they report that they felt seen personally, recognized personally, and loved by this light. So it seems to be something very relevant if you have so many people who have this phenomenon, and if you take it somewhat real, I think a theory of the mind, the soul, and what comes beyond somehow has to incorporate that. And I just want to, I cannot dig as deeply as I'd like to, but I feel that Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup and Faggin all don't have this element inside of their theories enough for me, at least. Maybe some of them even not at all. Yeah.
Although Federico talks about love a lot. And to me, and I speak as Piero, as ignorant and intellectually challenged Piero, but yet putting, qubits and love in the same sentence is not very helpful.
It's at least not very helpful.
I absolutely do not rule out that there might be a connection and combination, but unfortunately, I cannot see it at the moment, and it's I find it difficult. Whilst, sorry for keeping going back to Vedanta, the philosophical arguments of Vedanta are completely watertight. It starts with experience. It does not start with postulates or any philosophical idea. The beginning and the end of that philosophy is our mental life, what we experience from moment to moment. And from that, this gigantic, coherent, consistent, watertight edifice of thought, to the point that, we could stay here for hours, Vera, but I mean, I'm wondering myself, you mentioned the word proof not long ago, but we know that proof only exists in formal systems like mathematics. And in other areas of science, you never speak about proof.
I know. I would have to open an entire box and do video here. I used the word, but I didn't mean it very naively, really. But let me add before we come to our last section today, and we'll have a few more minutes to talk about grief and how to cope with grief, which is very, very relevant. But I just quickly wanted to say that I very much appreciate and like what you just said, that a system could be based entirely on our experience. Why? Because Chalmers so rightly said that there's a so-called hard problem of consciousness, that it's not understood by any means scientifically, and maybe never will be, but who knows how this individual perspective, these feelings come about. You may be able to explain the brain someday perfectly, but it doesn't yet show any way of explaining why there is an inner experience.
I tell you why, if I may, because that is all that exists.
Yeah.
We don't have a hard problem of consciousness. We have a hard problem of matter. We assume matter to exist, but we have no direct proof, no way even in principle to assume that there is a material universe that somehow corresponds to our perceptions and experiences. We don't even have a definition of matter. Roger Penrose says, of course I'm a materialist, and I'm not sure I know what matter is. A Nobel Prize winning theoretical physicist. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. And let me just quickly add that I was the German editor of Roger Penrose. I know him really well. We wandered through Heidelberg one winter afternoon and talked about nanotubules in the brain and how quantum mechanics and the mind may work together. So fantastic person to also look up if you're listening today. So let's come to our last section. I'm very sorry that we have only so little time left because we could be going, but I think it's very important that we wrap up today with a few more thoughts from your side on grief therapy. I wrote down a question that is important to me, and I'll give it to you, but you keep going in the direction that you find relevant for yourself. So my question would have been, does grief change when we do not see the deceased only as a memory, but as someone who may still exist in a meaningful way?
Colossally, enormously, dramatically. Okay, let's really try to go very fast about, we've lived for nearly a century in a world of psychotherapy of grief dominated by two ideas. The idea, the Freud's idea of the work of grief, that essentially, grief is a disease that has to be getting rid of. Through the work of grief, you essentially have to detach from, sever the links with your loved one, and open up to new experiences and this and that. I'm obviously summarizing in an absurd way, but we need to go fast. On top of that, then came the misinterpretation of the work of Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who studied the 5 stages of dying, and then they became somewhat mysteriously the 5 stages of grief. So that process of detachment, of accepting the loss, has to happen through 5 sequential stages, which are the same for everybody. And these 2 ideas dominated the world of grief therapy and they, to some extent, they still do today, right? Houston, we have a problem. There is not one shred of evidence for any of these 2 theories. Empirically, they have no foundation whatsoever, right? Thank God, in the mid-90s, a new theory, which is not really a theory, it's a way of systematizing empirical evidence eventually about grief. And this is a group of 22 researchers. There's an edited book called Continuing Bonds, which for me is really a watershed moment, as like, when any of the great physics theory came onto the field, and this is the case. And the fact that this is not a theory, these researchers went out and looked and observed what grieving people do after a loss. And most people do not sever the links with the deceased. The deceased remain a living presence in their lives for all the rest of their lives, right? And that continuing bonds morphs and transforms and adapts as people then, the negative consequences of grief, little by little, they wane and disappear, but the link remains there. And it's strongly adaptive. All the research points out how supportive and helpful this psychological presence is. In certain cases, this is not only a psychological presence, but as I say before, these continuing bonds become extrinsic because people have experiences of reunion with the deceased loved one. Visual, auditory, tactile, multisensorial, and everything. And as I say, research tells us that all these things are very adaptive and very helpful. Now, and here comes Piero. And I'm glad to go back to my medical roots. When I say medical, I mean my essential desire of being of help to people, okay? To try to make a difference for somebody who's not well. And it so happens that as I was reading, I go back to what I was telling at the beginning of the interview. As I was reading and learning about all these fascinating things, particularly concerning evidence that suggests survival, I immediately was struck by the thought that this information has a tremendous potential for 2 categories of people. Those who are in fear of death, either their own or a loved one's, and those who are in pain over the loss of a loved one, isn't it?
Yes.
There is empirical evidence that can support what I call a rational belief in life after life, not a belief based on accepting a doctrine, the words of a prophet, the words of a holy book, or some teachings, but based on the knowledge and critical evaluations of facts. So a rational belief. And that idea then took the form in 2010. Between 2010 and 2012, I put a stupid amount of work, about 2,000 hours of work, in producing essentially a video course, a course of academic level, but delivered in a manner to be accessible by anybody, systematically presenting the 12 areas that I see as supporting the idea of an afterlife. accompanied by a cognitive psychology style self-help manual, because it is not enough to accept. If one were to believe as a matter of faith, they could just as well believe a holy book. But I don't want people to believe me. I want people to believe themselves. I want people to learn and critically challenge what they have learned and hopefully emerge with what I call a rational belief in afterlife. And then after doing this, I donated this resource to the Forever Family Foundation, which is a non-religious, not-for-profit organization with about 15,000 volunteers around the world, dedicated, is a grief support organization. And for about 10 years, this resource has been used, and many, many people have used it. And many people wrote spontaneously to the foundation and to myself, saying this has been life transforming, this has helped so much. And so I was very happy, both intellectually and morally, that my thing had seemed to be good and seemed to have a good effect. But as a scientist, I know full well that this is anecdotal evidence. This could have been a small, non-representative, self-selecting sample of people. The fact that it helped a few hundreds, it was already good.
Yeah.
But not tell that this is a good approach. This bibliotherapy is essentially a bibliotherapy self-help approach to grief. And so I wanted to test it scientifically. And that was my doctorate at the University of Northampton. I did an outcome study with, grieving people. I measured psychometrically the levels of grief and various indicators of psychological health. Pre-test, then they were given 3 months to engage with this material, and then I measured these levels again post-test. As good as in-person psychotherapy.
Wow, that's very amazing. And what would you say? Why do you think that is?
Okay, so the quantitative part of the study looked at the fact that levels of grief come down. Cohen's d 0.54. It means a sizable effect at the border between medium and large effect. P 0.004, so highly statistically significant. In any outcome study in medicine, this would be a new drug would go onto the market immediately.
Yeah.
Then there was a qualitative part of the study. I interviewed some of my participants, and then I did a reflexive thematic analysis, and that adds depth and nuance because you can explore the experience of the people, right? So most of these people came already with some sort of belief in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And what really made the difference is that their existing beliefs were validated. People kept telling me it was so important for me to understand that there is so much scientific research about these things, that so many academics and serious people engaged with this. So this shored up and reinforced, and they brought their belief system entirely to another level. And the mother told me, the quote says, "I don't know how could I have survived if I didn't have this." She was thinking of taking her own life, and knowledge, information alone has saved her from tragic hardship. But you realize, there's really the power of knowledge and information extraordinary. Also, the other strand that comes out very strongly from the interview is that many people, as we said before, had experiences of contact with their deceased loved one, and they didn't know what to do with them. And the moment when they realized that they can interpret them for what they appear to be, right? So that, yes, I have seen my deceased husband. When a lady says I was driving out of my garage, reversing out of my garage, and as I was turning to my right to see if I wasn't hitting the post, my husband was there. in the flesh. And we had a few words, and then he slowly disappeared, right? That's your typical sensory experience of the disease. Now, these are hallucinations. The typical stupid, excuse my French, stupid explanations that the ill-informed skeptic says, knowing nothing about hallucinations, their phenomenology, what they are, how they present, nothing about who has hallucinations and why and how, etc. And so they discard this thing, saying that a grieving person hallucinates a loved one is tantamount to saying that a person who's drowning in debt hallucinates having won the lottery. The latter doesn't happen, so why does the first happen? We do not create a reality, an experiential reality, just because we want it or we need it. Plus, the lady, in that moment, she was driving the car. Her mind was onto something else, etc. Sorry, I'm in driving. So, extraordinary. And I think that this research is not about my tool. My tool was used in the research because that's what was available. It's a nice, neatly packaged thing that can be used in a test. But all the evidence tells us that it's engaging with information. It has to be serious information from credible sources, and God knows if we have a proliferation of, now you look, people say, I've done my research. Oh, really? What did you do? I watched some videos on YouTube. And God help us. We know on YouTube you find
anything you want, and the opposite.
Recommendation is that anybody is interested in this approach, make sure that you engage with credible information, academic sources, impossible peer-reviewed material. Not all of that is difficult, and often you find selection, popularizations of peer-reviewed material that's good for the general public. And it's the process of engaging and not automatically accepting. You have to look through it with your critical faculties, because that's the only way that you will come out convinced.
Absolutely, Piero. That's already a very good closing statement. All I wanted to add is that what I feel is so helpful in this is that as you engage more and more with the scientific research, you find confirmation, that's at least how I feel about it, that the loved one is not gone, that it's not only the imprint in your own memory, which some people seem to find consoling. I find it very disrespectful. If, all that remains of me is the memory in somebody else, I would be very sad about that. I want to be still my very self, something that NDErs talk about as well, and something that after death communication and contact seem to also confirm that something goes on. And I think we could be discussing a lot about where does that go? What is it all about? But I think it's very important to people to know that their loved ones with a high probability are not gone when the brain shuts off, but that they actually do go on. And to me, that was the most relevant point when I started diving into that research, to find confirmation also from a scientific point of view for that hope. Yeah.
Yes, totally agree. We're singing from the same ship. Totally.
That means, Piero, we're still on our travels. We will be traveling along many roads, still researching this topic for many, many more years, I hope, and for many new discoveries. So this is never at an end, So we have not tried to confirm what we wanted to find, and now we're there, but we'll keep researching. That's at least true for me, right? There is a picture that I start seeing, but I will stay scientific and keep questioning it. And I'll be very happy if people have many questions underneath our video as well. We'll post many links to the research. And as you said earlier, people who seriously want to engage and don't come with a bias that they want to defend, but who really want to enter into a conversation, they will always be welcome to ask questions and to engage with our research as well. So Piero, let me thank you so much for this conversation, for all the time you had, for sharing your thoughts, for sharing your insights into your research and your perspective. So it was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure for me too, Vera. Thank you very much. And thank you for our suffering public who endured It's us sharing our mutual enthusiasm.
That is completely right. Thank you everyone so much for staying with us. And I'm very happy to see you again next time in a new video. Piero, have a great day. Thank you so much for being here.
Bye.